Hi, this is our Soar Optimist International podcast, and we're so happy that you're listening to us. Here we talk about women's and girls' rights, gender equality, or in general, women's rights. We fight for the UN agenda and sustainability goals. So, to say it with the United Nations words, gender equality is not only a fundamental human right, but a necessary foundation for a peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable world. So, stay Soar Optimist and listen to us. Today, Elly Arrow is my guest. She is an activist for the abolition of prostitution. She is 23 years old and has a YouTube channel as well as a website called Die unsichtbaren Männer, which is a German website. You can see the links below. So, hi Elly, please tell us about your work and especially maybe why, especially such a young woman, is an activist against prostitution.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm Elly and I'm from Germany, and as many will know, Germany is a hotspot for prostitution. It is a very large industry here, but for the longest time living in this country, I wasn't aware. I started engaging in activism to end the system of prostitution about 3 years ago, but before that, I engaged with the topic itself, not necessarily by choice, but because various parts of the sex industry impact everybody's lives, especially the lives of girls or young women. And the topic specifically where it started for me and many others I know is engaging with pornography. As many of my generation, we don't have a free choice, a conscious choice to see pornography. We stumble upon it on the internet at some point. And for many of us, this is a very disturbing experience. It's confusing because very often what you see in pornography is a woman in pain and a woman being sexually humiliated. And in my opinion, as a whole generation growing up with these images and these videos and these concepts of sexuality that are dangerous and anti-woman. But it's difficult to name this because even though we pretend to be very sexually liberated in Germany, we don't freely talk about these things. We have this policy where everyone just kind of quietly agrees that this is normal and acceptable, but are we really talking about what sexuality is, what's healthy, and where abuse starts and where exploitation starts? No, we don't. And in the course of asking myself a lot of uncomfortable questions on the subject, I realized that the porn industry cannot be separated from the prostitution industry. It's one and the same. It's just one involves a camera and a script, and the pimp is behind the camera. And other times, it's the classic model with a prostituted woman and a John. What I do now is, first of all, informing the public about the reality, to get away from this abstract view of prostitution where it's called a sexual service or a job. Instead, trying to be specific about what actually happens physically, economically, socially in this realm, to engage people in discussions, to inform politicians of what's really happening, even when it's legal and when it's treated as a job by the government. And then specifically to talk about not just who are these women and why are they in this industry, also talk about who is the demand for the industry, who are these people who are overwhelmingly male, what drives them. And that's what my website is about. That collects information and statements from these men, what they themselves say as to why they buy sex and what they do when they are in the brothel or when they call up the so-called escort hotline.
Prostitution very often is called in one sentence with human trafficking. So I heard this very hard quote about the German situation about prostitution, which says that the number of prostitutes in Germany is not sufficient enough for the demand of sex by buying. So many women are taken from other countries, mostly East European countries, to come to Germany to work as prostitutes. What exactly happens there, and how's the situation in Germany, and especially how's the situation for the prostitutes who come from other countries to Germany?
So it's important to note that this is an inherent dynamic in prostitution. It's very obvious in Germany. We have now some official statistics from our government that the overwhelming number of people in prostitution is female, and they're immigrants from the poorest parts of Europe and then some Asia and North Africa, which shows us that, yes, there is a large demand for prostitution because it's been acceptable to buy access to the body of another person in our country actually for decades and decades. Actually, now it's been over a century. There's been various versions of legalization, certainly tolerance towards the man who pays. So lots of German men feel this is fine. It's fine to do this. Roughly about every fifth German man makes use of this industry. But there is just a huge lack, this is true for Germany and everywhere else, of volunteers. Very few women and men want to be in prostitution. But because it's a lucrative industry, because of this demand, the industry needs to be filled by people who are not in there voluntary. And it's important to note that there is this classic form of human trafficking that is violent, that can be somebody abducted on the street. That does happen. But human trafficking can be less obvious. It can be that a man fakes a relationship with a woman and she's in love with him, and then he tells her, I have all these debts that I need to pay and I don't know how to make money. Could you maybe just do this for me a few times? So trafficking isn't always a gun to a woman's head. It can be lies, false promises. Maybe she's told she'll have a babysitter job when she comes to Germany. Lots of types of trafficking and pimping don't leave a bruise on her face or body. And German legislation is just not equipped to deal with that. It's hardly equipped to deal with very physically brutal human trafficking. Even then, it requires the victim essentially to come forward in front of a court and speak against their pimp, who is often connected to a criminal network. So this is incredibly dangerous. Many victims refuse, which means they don't get access to justice many times. But if her situation is less obviously coercive, if the person is her boyfriend or her relative and he was just mentally coercive and abusive, then the German system is just not equipped to help her.
You just started talking about the men who buy sex. So I think that many people think that the men who buy sex are mostly the poorest, maybe the ugliest guys who don't have a girlfriend or were just left by their girlfriend and now they need a bit of love, and actually it's good to buy a bit of prostitution. But is that the case? Who are these men who buy sex, and do they know that they might support a maybe criminal system?
So there's a lot of misconceptions about Johns, and there's a lot of unwillingness to look, because the uncomfortable truth is that a John could be anybody we know, including someone who seems very nice or peaceful on the outside, including a very liberal man who likes talking about equality. Unfortunately, Johns come from all parts of society, and many of them are partnered. Many of them have a wife or a girlfriend. They may not even be sexually inactive in that relationship. They just feel like they're entitled to more. And many of these men, they have slightly above average education, and they make a little bit more money than the average guy, because prostitution does cost money. Not terribly much, but if you do it all the time, it does. And what unites all of them, even though they come from different backgrounds, they might be the homeless guy, they might be the regular office worker, or they might be the very high-profile politician. What unites all of them is that they feel entitled to sexual access to usually a woman's body. And It really bothers me when people talk about buying love or the sale of love or love for sale. It's really, if you look at the reality, one way you can do this is to see what these men themselves say, why they buy and how they buy. It's got nothing to do with romance, like this idea, oh, he takes her to a dinner and a movie, and then kind of like, what is this woman, what is this film, Pretty Woman? He pleasures her first, and then they have passionate sex in the bathtub or something. The reality is completely different. Even when it's escorting just means that he takes up the phone. He has an online catalog where he can order a woman like a pizza. He can order her according to her age, her skin color, her body weight, her the sizes of her breasts, or her butt. And he will later rate all of these and write a review of it online to his colleagues. Escorting just means that she comes to his house. Or he goes to the brothel. That's the other form of prostitution that's very common. And then he dictates to her, I want A, B, C, D, E. I want you to do these practices, and I want them for half an hour or an hour. He does not have to work to endear himself to her. He doesn't have to flirt with her for a day and then risk being turned down. Many people have this idea that she can just turn him down if she doesn't want to be with him, but it is an extremely competitive capitalist industry, and Johns know this. They know how to pressure women. They know that if they write a bad review or they threaten, I won't come to you anymore, you won't get my money, I'll go to some other woman because she does what I want. He doesn't even have to raise his fist to get what he wants. And when you see what Johns themselves say, you can read all of this online. They have forums where they talk to each other and admit all of this. They are frequently coercive, and not all of them have to be violent to achieve this. So they write these very detailed reviews, and they exchange all this information. They exchange information on where to get the kind of woman they want, according to her body type or her degree of vulnerability. This even, in some cases, goes so far as to working hand in hand with pimps, who, when they introduce women into prostitution, they need a woman who'll say yes to anything, because Johns want that, and when the police comes around, you need her to say, oh yes, this is all by choice. Many of the women you will find in a situation saying it's my choice before she is at that point where she's saying that to the John or the policeman or whomever. Many of these migrant women who are brought in, and Johns know this because they talk about it, are it's called breaking in, as you would with a racehorse or an animal. It is the intentional breaking of her spirit through rape until she learns to say yes to everything. So the John who goes to the brothel, and many of them know this and themselves say, I cannot distinguish between the woman whose smile is genuine and whose smile is the result of this, in essence, sexual torture. And that is the very uncomfortable truth, that every time a John goes to a brothel or orders up an escort hotline or anything, he is taking the risk of committing commercialized abuse. And this is a very uncomfortable truth that in Germany we're not quite ready yet to face, but slowly starting to talk about.
There's this Swedish model which states that prostitution is illegal. The whole Johns are criminalized by buying sex, and Sweden just introduced it. Not only introduced it, but other countries took this model as well. What do you think about it, and how's the situation in Germany?
So the approach in Sweden in many ways can be considered the polar opposite to the German one. The German one says this is a job, and if we regulate it, if the state just says, oh, you guys, can you please use condoms, that this will mitigate the problems in the industry, and that violence and objectification, all this is just a byproduct. The Swedish approach says, no, unfortunately, this is inherent to commercialized sex. And the only way to fight it is to decrease demand, and this is And you do this by criminalizing the buyer, by saying buying access to another person's body is fundamentally not okay. It's fundamentally an affront to sex equality between migrants and locals, etc. So while the Johns and the pimps are criminalized, the people who sell access to their bodies are not. The idea is that the hope is to build trust between police and social workers and these mostly women in the trade, so that they know their rights and they know they can come forward if something happens, and they don't have to prove that they were victims of a horrific crime. Just somebody buying sex to them alone is a crime. So this gives them some degree of bargaining power when they take a John to the authorities. They report one to the authorities. And it's very important in order for this to work to really train social workers and police. In Germany, many women who go to the authorities experience that they really don't know the reality of the trade. They don't know how dangerous it is. They don't know that getting out of this industry by oneself alone is very, very tricky. But in Sweden, there's concrete investment into exit strategies that support women to start new lives. And it's also important, an important part is, even though the industry is so big in Germany, the public discussion on the issue is still just now happening when it's been overdue for a very long time. In Sweden, the government itself says we need to have this conversation about sexual consent and the commercialization of it. Teach young people that this is an acceptable behavior. We want a culture that frowns upon somebody who would, instead of, even if it's just for one evening, instead of endearing themselves to someone else and having sex based on mutual attraction, abuse various types of vulnerabilities to get sexual access. They want a culture where that's fundamentally unacceptable. And a very important part is, it is this cultural shaming of the men who pay, so that ideally with each generation the number of them decreases, and there is some statistical evidence that this is happening, where if you do buy sex, you will be fined. If you keep doing it, you can get a prison sentence. And more importantly, if someone finds out, if your partner finds out, your friends find out, your boss, they won't think you're this sexually liberated alternative guy, or instead of like your body being like telling you that you're such a cool, edgy guy, you'll experience social exclusion. That is the change that they want to achieve. So that future generations of boys won't even dream of buying another person. And that girls and young women know that someone who asks to commercialize their body in any shape or form does not have their best interests at heart. While in Germany, we have the opposite situation. For me, one very important insight on this was a survivor of prostitution here in Germany. Her name is Sandra Norak. She said that her pimp used the legislation of Germany to justify what he was doing, to say this is just a job and don't worry your head about it. It's fine. Lots of people do it. It's socially accepted. This social acceptance makes it easier for exploitation to occur. But if society instead sees this as exploitative and as disrespectful, then it becomes harder to entice somebody into the industry.
So we talked a lot about the guys. Now maybe we can talk about the prostitutes, or the women who live in prostitution, or the women who came out of prostitution, so the exited women. You know some exited women and you've talked to them. So what do women who live in prostitution experience, and what did women tell you who came out of prostitution.
So it's very important for abolitionists to listen to what women say who experience it, and it's important to say that this conversation is often tricky because not all women who are in prostitution or relief have the same perspective, but all of them have something important to tell us. Many of them, of course, are witnesses to violence to themselves and to other women in the brothels and in various parts of the industry. They can help us get away from this very abstract view and just be very clear what actually happens to the body, what happens to the mind. I strongly recommend, there's a website from prostitution survivors in Germany. It's called Netzwerk Ella. I'm sure there'll be a link down below, where the women themselves write about various aspects. Why do they get in? How can this even happen to a middle-class woman? While the majority are immigrants, there are German women too who enter prostitution. What is the thing that happens before? Then what is the reality like once you're in? And all the different barriers that stop you from getting out. Like, they are the best people to explain to you in very concrete terms what that's like, physically, emotionally, and the social reality and the barriers. They share experiences, obviously, with the Johns, but also with the outside world, because it is true, as many people who support legalized prostitution tell us, that there is a social stigma against women in prostitution. They are still seen as a source of sin or a source of spreading illnesses, etc. What it's like to live with that when you actually often have limited control over your situation, and it's the John who decides if there is a condom, and it's the John who decides the practices in many cases, sadly. But it's also important to listen to women who say they've had bad experiences with authorities and with police. Yeah, because the reality for many women, especially in places with criminalization, but even here in Germany, is that they sometimes feel caught between a rock and a hard place. The industry is not kind to them, but the outside world doesn't really accept them either. Also, a very important lesson I find from exited women, so women who've left prostitution and analyzed their experience afterwards. For many, it's only possible to do this analysis once you're out, because when you're in, you're trying to survive, you're trying to get through your day, you're trying to feed your kids. You don't have time to think about the political dimension or the social dimension. I'm not saying you can't, but it's harder. And one thing these women say is that the very well-intended division between the woman who chooses and the woman who's forced doesn't always work, because there's a gigantic gray area where you have women who don't have a gun held to their head every day, but this doesn't mean it's a free choice. Like, they can really tell you about all these nuances, that in order that there must be this understanding in society that we need non-judgmental services for women. It doesn't matter how she got in or why, or if she spent 10 years defending it and saying it's my choice. The moment she says, I need support or I need to get out, we should believe her and support her. And as my final point, the same thing goes when we speak publicly. If we have a panel, a presentation, and we invite women, it's good to do more than just ask them to tell their personal stories and trauma. That's very difficult to do, first of all, especially when it's traumatic, which it often is. But also, don't just treat them as victims. Many of them experience this as dehumanizing as well, as being reduced to their traumatic experiences. Don't just say, oh, come on, tell us your personal pain, but really ask them, how can we solve this issue? What policy approaches do you support? What have we been doing right? What have we been doing wrong? They're the best people to tell you what to do.
So the exchange with exited women is very helpful and needed to understand what happens in prostitution and what the women experience. But obviously not all the women in prostitution talk or are able to talk. So there are some other sources to get information about the situation in prostitution, and especially what happens between the men and the women. So you have the website, The Invisible Man. The link is down below. So which information do you get on the internet and from other sources about prostitution and the situation there?
So one good way to start a conversation, be that personally or in your friendship circle or with politicians, is to utilize the information that Johns give us themselves as they exchange among themselves on online forums. They talk to each other about their consumption of prostitution very openly, very explicitly. And there are various projects from several countries, and mine is the German version, so Die unsichtbaren Männer is German for the invisible men, but you'll find similar projects from the UK, Canada, France, and Israel. And so the people behind, including me, behind this website, we've created these websites as resources to use for anybody. My page, which does focus on men from Germany, a little bit Austria and Switzerland, mostly Germany, all of the content is translated into English, so the international community can use this. If somebody comes to you and says, oh, the German model is so great, they don't have any problem with violence anymore because everybody needs a license, then you can just link to the website. You can, on the website, find quotes by Johns, and there are hundreds of them, and they are sorted into specific categories. So if you're discussing, for example, somebody asks you, oh, can you give me some evidence for the racism in the industry? There's a specific category that you can go to that'll give you quotes just on that. Or you're discussing drug addiction, or you're discussing objectification, and people ask you, what do you mean prostitution is objectifying? Instead of you having to write this gigantic essay, you can just link to the words of the Johns. And if people are still skeptical and they're like, well, you cherry-picked hundreds of quotes, okay, no problem. Ask them to do their own research. Just a fair warning, much of this content is very disturbing, is very explicit. It's not appropriate for minors. Please don't send it to people with a previous history of sexual trauma, certainly not without a trigger warning. I think that's very appropriate in this situation, but overall, it is a good resource, especially for people who are skeptical and who want concrete evidence. And especially, I'd like to encourage everyone to utilize these kinds of resources to talk to your politicians. Ask them. They need to position themselves and say, do we tolerate this? Yes or no? If the answer is no, what are we going to do about it? So that is one resource that I very strongly recommend.
I really hope that we're working together with our politicians against prostitution. What is your wish for the future? And what do you think you can do, or we all can do, together with politics in the fight against prostitution?
I would not pretend otherwise. I do support the Nordic model, but before you can have a Nordic model and have it working, it is important that you have a broader conversation in society. People need to really understand what prostitution is and why it's necessary to abolish it. You need to have a lot of uncomfortable conversations, and we're starting to have them, about men who are a part of your communities, not these strange men somewhere out there committing crimes, but men who could even be sharing your home. This is painful, but it's very necessary. It's necessary for everyone in society. To talk about this, to talk about the men, to talk about what kind of sexuality we want in general. Do we want pornography to influence us? Are we comfortable by enhancing our personal masturbation or our fantasies through an industry that is more than ethically questionable? What are alternatives? How can we educate young people? How can we satisfy their curiosity in other ways maybe? Or since it's difficult to regulate the internet, still teach them when they see this kind of stuff how to handle it so that they won't be alone with their feelings and thoughts on it. How can we provide a safety net for especially migrants or other vulnerable populations so they don't have to end up in prostitution, but also so they aren't deported back to their home countries immediately when found, because that's not a solution that any of us support. We don't want to get rid of migrants. We want migrants to have real opportunities. And it's important to acknowledge that prostitution isn't one of those, that it doesn't raise the vast majority of people out of poverty, and it will continue the subjugated status of migrants if they're seen as easily purchasable. And this is maybe another thing that I should note, that it's really important for all of us to talk about this because it concerns all of us. The image portrayed of women, of ethnic minorities, etc., in pornography and in prostitution reflects back on us. And this is how we get the situation that, for example, in Germany, many Eastern European women, when they tell people that they're Russian or Ukrainian or Romanian, there is this assumption that, oh, well, maybe I can harass her, I can access her, I can buy her. The same happens to women who live in the vicinity of red light districts. They're not prostituted themselves, but they walk down the street at night and the car slows down and rolls down the window. Is that a society we want to live in? Like, we cannot run away from this conversation, as uncomfortable as it is. We need to have it because it concerns everybody. And we're starting to have it, and I have a reasonable amount of hope for the future because the Nordic model is spreading and this conversation is reaching more and more people. And I hope lots of you listeners will be part of that.
Thank you very much, Elly. I really have to say that it's incredible how much knowledge you have about the situation in prostitution. So I really, really encourage everyone who's listening to get more information, get to the links, get more informed, and try to be an activist against prostitution also. So thank you very much for this interview today, and I hope to hear from you prospectively, and I really hope that our fight against prostitution is going to be successful.